Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're delving into a gripping Reddit story titled, "My Fiancé and His Family Have Been Lying to Me for Years." Join me as we unravel this intricate tale of love, deception, and unexpected twists. Let's dive in. 3 months ago, I, 31F, discovered that my current fiancé, Frank, 32M, and my ex-fiancé, Jason's 32M, parents were lying to me. They had led me to believe that he had died in a shootout between police and drug dealers. I am about to get married in 3 days' time. I just wanted somewhere to vent about this. Let me start at the beginning. When I was 20 years old, Jason was a neighbor of mine. If I were to say I was unimpressed with him, that would be an understatement. He would let people push him around and didn't seem to stand up for himself. At the time, I was a model. I didn't make a lot from modeling, but it was enough to pay for my rent and necessities with a little left over for myself. I had always heard that there was always a danger of stalkers, but I hadn't believed it until it happened to me. He had developed an obsession with me and would always appear at the places I was modeling as well as events I attended. Up till this point, I was able to ignore it to a degree. But then he started appearing where I shopped and even near where I lived. And somehow Jason had heard about it and would walk me to my car and even offered to go shopping with me. I remember I was actually a bit rude to him. After all, how could someone so cowardly protect me? But somehow I actually started to feel safe and comfortable when he was around. I started getting feelings for him and even asked him out for coffee a few times. And then apparently the stalker started to get jealous or something, because one of the days the stalker suddenly attacked me with a knife in the parking lot, shouting that in death we would be together forever. Luckily, Jason was there. When he tackled the stalker and put him in a headlock, he looked so heroic. He didn't even flinch when the knife cut his arm. I think that was the moment I fell in love with him. When the police came, all I saw was him. Until this moment, I had thought he was a coward, but in that moment, I saw what I believed was the real him. Without the stalker, I was terrified that we would go back to being strangers. It's funny how he went from being a nuisance to someone that I couldn't imagine not being around. And then when he asked me out 2 days later, I was so giddy. I had never felt this way before. After a couple of dates, he came clean and told me he was a cop. That was how he had heard about my stalker and that he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. And when he told me that I couldn't tell his family because of Frank's trauma, his family wouldn't understand and it was just upset them, and I believed this. A couple of months later, we went to meet his parents. And Frank was there. He had this smug grin on his face and undressed me with his eyes. I couldn't stand him. From the way Jason spoke of him, this was not what I expected. And every time I was alone with him, he tried to flirt with me. To be totally honest, he disgusted me, and this seemed to upset him. A week later, he crashed his car and Jason lent him his, which he didn't even watch because it got stolen. I still remember thinking that he had been petty and crashed his car on purpose because I was interested in him because he knew that Jason would lend him his. And when they found drugs in the car, I remember thinking that it wouldn't surprise me if it was Frank's, but now I know the truth. 3 years later, Jason proposed to me, and I said yes. That was the happiest day of my life. I was already planning out the wedding, and then 8 months later, I found out I was pregnant. We were both so happy and the future looked so bright. And then 2 months later, his parents phoned me and asked me to come over. They had something important to discuss with me. When I arrived, Frank was also there, and you could see that his mother had been crying. They told me that Jason was dead. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been shot in a gunfight between police and drug dealers. I remember thinking that he must have been one of the cops and that I couldn't tell them because I didn't want to tarnish their memory of him. And I also felt that if I told them the truth, that would mean it was real. He was never coming back. Frank offered to help me with the baby and to be there for me, and his parents insisted I take him up on his offer. I was so heartbroken and saw that I just agreed. And over the next 2 years, he didn't make a move on me and was just a friend who I came to rely on. But then we started to have feelings for each other, and then 3 years after Jason died, we started dating. We had the full support of Jason's parents. 2.5 years later, Frank proposed to me. I turned him down, saying that I was still mourning Jason and wasn't ready for marriage yet. We had an argument where he shouted that he couldn't understand why I was mourning that drug dealer. I remember in the heat of the moment, I shouted back that he was a cop, not a drug dealer. He was so shocked that I thought Jason was a cop that for the first time ever he had a look of shock on his face. And that's when he told me the truth, or at least part of it. He told me that the truth was that Jason was one of the drug dealers. I refused to believe it, and so he called Jason's parents, and they corroborated his story. They apologized to me for covering it up, but they didn't want to tarnish Jason's memory with me. I remember just breaking down and crying. 2 days later, I agreed to marry Frank, and I finally moved on. Until 6 months later, Jason came back from the dead, or to be more precise, prison. Frank and his parents apologized, saying that since Jason had been given a 30-year sentence, they were scared that I wouldn't move on, and he was only released because of a technicality. I refused to see Jason and didn't want him to see my son, but his parents insisted that I let him see his son once a week. I agreed as long as I wasn't there. But after a few visits, I decided to be there to make sure he didn't hurt my son. And he still tried to tell me I'd been undercover. He still expected me to believe his lies. So I told him that I knew the truth, that Frank and his parents had told me he was just a common drug dealer, and that I was no longer that innocent girl that would just believe his lies. After this, I refused to speak to him or let him see my son. His lies weren't going to hurt my family anymore, and now I am just focused on my wedding and my future with Frank and my son. My wedding was 3 days ago. The last 3 days are a blur. After the wedding, apparently my parents took me home, but I was in such a bad state that I had to be taken to the hospital and placed under psych evaluation. They were scared I would hurt myself. Today I am doing a little better, but since I still can't talk about what happened, they encouraged me to write about it. So here I am. I still remember how beautiful that morning was, and how I kept telling myself it was the happiest day of my life. It was an outdoor wedding. Frank had chosen the vineyard. The caterers had arrived early and started setting up when Frank's side of the family started to arrive. He had told me about them. They were related to his bio dad, not to his adopted parents, though they were also invited. I remember hearing the revs of motorbikes, and then a bunch of heavily tattooed bikers arrived. I remember that they had an air of danger about them. The leader, an older gentleman, had come to me and introduced himself as Capone. I remember Frank had told me about Capone. He was like an uncle to him and was called Capone because he looked like Al Capone. Maybe before he got all the tattoos, but right now I couldn't see the resemblance. They were a rough bunch and made me very nervous, but they were important to Frank, so I thanked them for coming and chatted with them for a while. I remember greeting Frank's parents and how happy they were. I remember thinking that when Jason introduced me to them, they were nowhere near as happy. Eventually, I went to get ready before Frank arrives. It's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. It was a beautiful white wedding dress. I had actually chosen this wedding dress almost 7 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to return it after being told Jason had been killed. I was going to get a new dress, but Frank told me he really liked this dress and wanted me to wear it on our wedding. Putting it on actually made me cry a little. I remember telling myself it was just nerves. I remember my father walking me down the aisle and seeing Frank standing by the podium looking so dashing. I remember seeing my son Jason standing there smiling, my little ring bearer. I remember when we got to the vows, my mind went blank while Frank was saying his vows. And then suddenly chaos. Suddenly some of the staff suddenly attacked the bikers, while men in tactical gear rushed in tackling the bikers, while shouting for everyone to keep their hands where they could see them. The bridesmaids were screaming, while I rushed towards my son Jason and just hugged him tight, trying to shield his body with mine. And Frank was still his confident self, demanding to know what's going on and that they would regret this. He only lost his calm when the police took of his helmet. Suddenly he went pale and looked like he saw a ghost. He then rushed at this man and tried to hit him, but was easily thrown to the ground with his arm held behind his back. It was only when this man started listing off his charges that I suddenly recognized him. It was Jason. Frank had told me that Jason might try to do something at the wedding, but I couldn't believe he would do this. I saw red and started shouting at him. Words that I now regret, how he was being jealous and petty, and even worse stuff. But he just ignored me and carried on listing the charges. I remember he got to the charge of attempted murder. How ludicrous. Frank couldn't hurt a fly. So I asked him who he had attempted to murder. And for the first time since he burst and he looked directly at me and said something that smashed my reality. It was him. 9 months earlier, Frank had put a hit on him in prison and he almost died. It was like I was doused in cold water. I had been in shock, so I hadn't noticed that he was in a police uniform. And 9 months ago, that was when I had that argument with Frank and accidentally let slip that he was a cop. It was all my fault. Jason has almost died because I broke my promise to him about not letting his family know. Why didn't I trust him? I had a nervous breakdown and had to be sedated. Why didn't I trust him? Why did I choose to believe Frank? His family have been trying to contact me, but I have told the nurses and my family that I don't want to see them. I am not ready to forgive them, and I don't know if I ever will be. For 6 years, they had lied to me. And not only that, they were the ones who had pushed for me to let Frank help me with the baby, and had helped Frank gaslight me in regards to Jason being a cop. Even when I had brought up that I had seen Jason in uniform and had seen his badge, they had supported his reasoning of criminals dressing up as police to commit crimes. And what has also terrified me is once I calmed down, I started to realize that all of Frank's family that had arrived were criminals. Criminals he had brought to my wedding where my son was. I had allowed a snake to enter my home, and if Jason hadn't exposed him, I don't know what would have happened in the future. I have had family members contact me angry that Jason chose this day to arrest Frank. I don't agree with them. Even if Jason never forgives me, I will always be grateful that he got Frank out of mine and my son's life. In a few days, I will be allowed to go home, but I don't think I can face Jason yet. I made a big mistake, and even though it was because I was fed lies by those I trusted, I should have had more faith in Jason. It feels like my heart is breaking, like how I felt when his parents told me he was dead. Even though it hurts so much, how much worse must it be for Jason? At least I still have my family. Jason lost everything. 3 months ago, I finally mustered up the courage to speak to Jason. At first, it was very awkward. I couldn't stand this awkwardness between us, so I started crying and couldn't stop apologizing, and then Jason started apologizing. Turns out that the whole time I had locked myself in my room thinking that Jason hated me. He was also thinking that I hated him. We ended up speaking for a couple of hours, and I felt so safe and comfortable. I had missed this. Jason is the only person that gave me such a strong sense of safety and of being loved unconditionally. I don't remember when, but I fell asleep. When I woke up, we were cuddling on the couch, and I felt better than I had in over a month. I actually thought we would get back together after this, and everything would be like it was. But he never asked me out or to move in with him. He visited us regularly and hung out with me and our son. But then the trial started 2 months ago, and from what I heard, the trial could take a year or two to finish, especially since it was such a high-profile case. And even though the trial has only just begun, there had already been a massive bombshell. And it hit Jason really hard. He was already struggling to forgive his parents, so after this I don't know if he ever will. Don't worry, they didn't do anything. No. The bombshell was that Frank is actually Jason's half-brother. And when I heard this, I also thought what you were thinking, Jason's mother, and had an affair with Frank's father, but no, that's not it. Jason's father, Alex, is both of their fathers. Apparently, Frank's father was actually his grandfather. Apparently, Alex had fallen in love with Ethan's daughter, Stacy. And since Alex had a good job, and Ethan wanted his daughter to have a normal life, he gave his blessing and they got married. And since and was one of her best friends, she was one of her bridesmaids. And then 6 months later, Stacy was pregnant with him, and the happy couple were over the moon. And then 3 months later and became pregnant, and she claimed that the pregnancy was a result of a one-night stand, and she didn't know who the father was. But when Stacy was near term, she came home a day early from visiting her father accidentally, heard her husband arguing with her best friend about the baby. She heard enough to know her husband was the father. Apparently, she had confronted them, and after a big argument, she had taken the car to go to her father. But she was in such an emotional state that she ended up crashing the car. Unfortunately, she died 2 days later in the hospital, but they were able to save the baby. Her father had been devastated. He had taken the baby and told his son-in-law that he was dead to him and wasn't worthy to be his grandson's father, and so he would raise him himself. And then Alex had married Anne. And then the real reason they took in Frank was because they were the only living relatives. And they learned from the social workers that Frank had been heavily abused by his grandfather. He was already a drinker, but apparently after his daughter's death, he spent most of his time drinking and gambling, and he also came to resent Frank for his daughter's death. He used to hit him and tell him that if he had never been born, he would still have a daughter. When Jason's parents heard this, they had felt so guilty. They had pretty much abandoned with his abuser. And they both still felt guilty about his mother's death, and they had sworn to make it up to him. He became their priority, and Jason was relegated to the background. Jason is still coming to terms with this. This is just another one of their lies exposed. After my breakdown, I had quit my job and had focused on my son and on my mental health. But I have also been thinking of the future. I have been thinking about becoming a social worker for a while now. Frank had talked me out of it. But now hearing about Frank's childhood, I have decided to study to become a social worker. Jason has been fully supportive and even helped me sign up. I don't know what will happen with Jason, but I will wait for him no matter how long it takes. It has been a week since the sentencing, and it feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders. Over the last 2 years, the relationship between Jason and our son has improved a lot. He hasn't called him dad yet, but I think that's just because it feels awkward. But he just needs a little more time. Jason had asked me to leave our son with my parents while he takes me out. He had something very important to discuss with me. I was very excited. I wasn't sure if it was a date or not, but I dressed myself as if it was. When I got to the restaurant, Jason told me how stunning I looked. I saw he had a folder with documents next to him, so I was a little disappointed, but I didn't let it show. We first had dinner while having small talk. Both of us avoided talking about Frank. We talked about his mother. It seems he has decided to give his mother another chance and forgive. His father hasn't even tried to contact him. He most likely knows that Jason wants nothing to do with him. After dinner and a glass of wine each, Jason opened the folder. He told me he had been given a commendation, but that he turned it down. Not only that, but he also handed in his resignation. Apparently, he had already decided to do this 2 years ago, and the only reason he waited was that he wanted to first see Frank sentenced. There was too many bad memories, and he wanted to do something different, but where he was still helping people. He was going to be a private investigator and specialize in missing person cases. He will make his money from high-profile wealthy customers, and he will use this money to do pro bono cases for those without money. He showed me his business plan, as well as his PI license. I was happy for him. And then he accidentally bummed one of the documents onto the floor. He quickly apologized and ducked down to pick it up. Next thing I noticed, he was on one knee with a ring in his hand. He asked me if I would marry him. I burst into tears. I must have said yes like 10 times. I had started to think that he hadn't asked me out because he didn't want me. But the whole time he had decided to pause his life until Frank was gone for good. And now we are at a new beginning. For Frank it is the end. For us it is just a beginning. It's been a month since Frank escaped and decided to ruin everything. Within the first week, he organized an attack on Jason's offices. Jason has been trying to downplay the attack. But not only did the attack cause lots of damages, but they stole also documents as well as computers and laptops, all containing sensitive info on cases he has been involved in regarding missing people. As of now, we don't know what Frank is going to do with this information. And they started a fire when they left. And then he sent Jason those 15 videos. I don't know if Frank made them as insurance or if he was planning to send them to Jason after the wedding. Jason thought the videos might be execution videos and wanted to forward the videos to police. I thought that they might be ransom videos and advised that we open one first. We chose the smallest file to download, And as soon as we opened the first video, I almost fainted. I felt like throwing up. That bastard had been recording us, and I looked so disgusting in this video. I looked like an animal in heat, and the way we were running sweating made me nauseous. It was pure lust. There was no love or emotion. Just looking at this video, I don't know what I ever saw in Frank. And I couldn't even begin to imagine what Jason was feeling seeing me like that. But I never expected him to ask why I never showed him that expression. I tried to explain that that was just lust without love. I don't know if Jason understood what I was trying to say. He is feeling insecure and thinks that I am just trying to comfort him. But I honestly do think that Jason is far better in bed. Frank was like a drug, where it was physically good, but afterwards you just feel dirty and need a shower. Jason, on the other hand, made me feel good both physically as well as emotionally, and afterwards I would bask in the warm afterglow. I don't think he realizes the effect he has on me, how I constantly think about him and want to be with him, and how he excites me. After seeing that video, I was devastated, both because Jason had seen it and the worry of who else has seen it or who else will. After all, this is Frank we are talking about. But then I started to worry about what else he would send Jason. Did he have me followed? Does he have pictures or video? So I bit the bullet and decided to confess to Jason. After Frank's arrest, we hung out together a lot, but we didn't start dating again. I thought that maybe Jason was just trying to be friendly for our son. So after a year of my friends trying to get me to go on dates, I finally gave in and went on dates. For the June 1st months, nothing happened. I would go on a date and then turn down a second. However, on month 7 of dating, I had a bad day and drank a bit too much on the date, and I ended up sleeping with my date. There was no pleasure, and I just felt dirty afterwards. And then a month later, it happened again, and again I just felt dirty. And then a couple months later, it happened again, though I don't remember drinking so much and just waking up alone in a hotel room. And when I showered, I realized he hadn't used protection. I remember a couple weeks later, I was throwing up in the morning. So I took a pregnancy test. It was positive, but then Jason phoned me. He told me that he had something important to discuss with me over dinner. And then that night he proposed to me, and I was so happy. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I felt loved, and I didn't feel dirty afterwards. When I woke up, I decided to have an abortion, and that Jason didn't need to ever know. So I made up some excuse and went to the hospital and had it done. And then I kept this secret. And over the years, the guilt has been a heavy weight. But I always felt that, like he said when he proposed, that was a new beginning. Everything else was a past. Honestly, when I confessed, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I could see that it really hurt him, but I believe we can get through this. But for the last month, he has been distant and doesn't want to even touch me. And at times, he seems broken. I don't know how to get through to him. But all I can do is be there for him. And when he is ready to talk, I will be here. I will not lose him again. I will not let Frank take him from me again. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story or have thoughts about it, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping tales from Reddit. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that connect us all